And welcome to this forum where we will be hearing about the Trinity History Project. If you were at the 9:30 service, you know that Sam has said more eloquently anything that I can say. So if you have not heard his sermon, please stay at 11:15 and hear that, because I think that really sets the context for what we're doing today. We want to do three things today. We want to hear from the four parishioners who have authored this study of the history of Trinity. We want to welcome our guest, Peggy Bendroth, and hear her words of wisdom as context for this work. And finally, we want to invite you into further conversation about this project going forward. There'll be copies available for you and a schedule of meetings coming up that we hope will be of interest to you and that you will continue to engage with us. This year, we're emphasizing the building of community through pray, love, and serve. We are becoming more intentional in our relationships with each other in a variety of ways. We have opportunities to listen to each other deeply, to develop skills in telling our own stories, and to become more closely the body of Christ. Today, we are broadening this listening, because today we are entering into conversation with our ancestors, who are part of the communion of saints, which we believe surrounds us and guides us in all our doings. To help us understand this, we are happy that today Margaret Peggy Bendroth is joining us. Peggy is the director of the Congregational Library on Beacon Hill here in Boston. She is an authority in church history, and in particular she works with parishes and congregations as they engage in their own history. She has met with our team, and she has produced a wonderful book called The Spiritual Practice of Remembering. It's available in the bookstore. This is a little shameless plug because this is an awesome book. So to help us set the context for our conversation today and going forward, I'm pleased to introduce Peggy Bendroth. Thank you, everybody. I kind of feel like everything that needs to be said has been said this morning, but I'm just going to try and add a little bit, just begin our time with some meditation. You know, it's a real honor and a pleasure, but also a challenge to be with you this morning as you open a conversation that is very important and all too rare. The past is a complicated place, not because of all those names and dates, you know, that's not really what history is, I keep telling people, but because it's so demanding, and in the end it's so mysterious. And perhaps that's why most people, and in my experience most congregations, try to keep it safely in its place. You know, we love our lists of the famous firsts, great achievements, great names. This is an easy kind of history, the kind that does not creep up from behind and pose questions that are hard, sometimes all but impossible to answer. We are all here today because we recognize that remembering is not an option. Talking about history is not a luxury, a hobby for buffs, something that we can put down to an enriching experience. It's about the hard work of being human. And I would also add, it's the challenge thrown out to us by our Jewish and Christian traditions. Both Christianity and Judaism are what one historian has called religions of remembrance. Now, think of it. Basically, our central rituals in both faiths are reenactments of past events, the Passover Seder, and of course the Eucharist. We as Christians are called to remember Jesus, this do in remembrance of me. But there's more to it than that. So much of the Bible is about not forgetting, about keeping important things always in mind. It's the prophets reminding Israel of covenant promises, bringing them back to center when they've gone astray. It's reminders of those mighty acts of God. God was faithful once, God will continue to be faithful. Remembering can heal, as the psalmist says, my soul is cast down, therefore will I remember thee. But remembering is also an ethical duty. It's something that the strong do on behalf of the weak. We are the voices for the voiceless. We are the living speaking on behalf of the dead. And so part of the burden of faith today is that we as the church are called on to remember terrible things. The Holocaust, the genocides of the 20th century, in this case, of course, slavery and racism, because that is how we stop them from happening again. At bottom, what the Bible teaches is that remembering is not just a mental activity. You know, it's not about finding the car keys or remembering the name of the person who's standing in front of you. It's an action. It's a commitment with consequences. It's something that we do that involves the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. And so it has to become a spiritual practice, something that we slowly weave into our lives until it begins to sift down and change us. Really what we're after is history for grown-ups. It's a relationship with our ancestors that is as morally complex as they were and as we are now. You know, we oftentimes use parental language to talk about our mothers and fathers in the faith. I find that very, very telling. They're not our parents. They are our peers, our spiritual brothers and sisters. And so as we know that most powerful metaphor from the Christian tradition is that enormous communion of saints, stretching across time and geography, including both the living and the dead. And you know, the dead are not always very easy to get along with. In fact, seeing dead people can be profoundly unsettling. And I'm not just talking about, you know, floating bed sheets or clanking chains. On the one hand, the dead are utterly familiar. You know, you read your history books, you do your exploration, you discover, yeah, they got tired sometimes, they felt happy, they liked their family sometimes they didn't. They all tried to do the best with what they had. But just when we're starting to get comfortable around our ancestors, they do something shocking. Something to show us, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that they are not just kind of filmy versions of ourselves. They're people from a different country, as one author has said, in a different time and place, with its own rules and expectations, its own insights, and its own blind spots. And because of that, we cannot judge them solely by our present-day standards of tolerance. In some ways, they could not have known. You know, as your own history shows, battling ending slavery, battling racism was and still is a lot of work. It's a process that took place sometimes in small steps, other times in leaps and bounds. And so if we just assume that they should have known, we are in some ways minimizing the pain of the struggle itself. The rules of time and place are enormously powerful, and they do not give way easily. And so, you know, right off, history for grown-ups forces us to be humble. We're not higher up on some moral ladder than our ancestors. We can't look down and shake our heads and wish that they were as enlightened as we are today. I get this question a lot in the work that I do, and I think, well, yes, we have, for example, wheelchair ramps in our culture. We have all kinds of things that our ancestors wouldn't have dreamed of, but we've also created weapons of mass destruction on a scale that they couldn't have dreamed of. So I think in the end it all kind of evens out. As people of this particular time and place, we have our own prejudices and limitations, many of them which are simply invisible to us. We're all going to go back, or many of us will go back and watch pro football this afternoon, and you know, that's something our grandchildren may wonder about. We can guess, but we cannot completely know how our descendants will judge us, what kind of legacies, both good and bad, that we are leaving behind. You know, studying history has taught me one thing. It's that nobody has a God's eye view of truth. No one gets to say that they're right and everyone else is wrong. We're all in this together. We're bearing witness to sin and neglect, but also to bravery and moral courage. Now, at the same time, though, we are not here to issue anybody a free pass, as if they could not possibly have known. Some people did. That's why things changed. Many of our ancestors heard long and loud that slavery was evil, that racism was unjust, and many of them chose not to listen. They dismissed prophetic voices as too radical, impractical. They built neat moral compartments, pretending not to see the sufferings of others when they were there as plain as day. The rules of time and place are strong walls. They're strong walls, but they're not solid walls. They're not too strong for us to break through. They are a framework, really. They set our limits, they set our possibilities, but they do not determine how we act and think. You know, I don't really, I've long since given up looking for heroes, people to emulate in history, or villains, people to, just hold up as examples of all evilness. Most often when I'm reading history or doing research, I kind of look for that one person who somehow finds a way to do the right thing, even if it's as small as an ant pushing a grain of sand up a hill. In the end, history for grown-ups means that we respect our ancestors enough to engage them, to know who they were, what they did, and to stay in conversation with them. That means celebrating them, thanking them, but maybe also yelling at them. It may mean pounding the walls in anger and frustration for all of the pain and injustice that they bequeath to us. And from what I know of them, I think they can take it. It means learning to understand their world as best we can, as we would from a visitor from another part of the world. And of course, it means, as your report, which I admire greatly, it shows so well that history for grown-ups takes so much hard work and long hours figuring things out. In the end, we all need each other to tell the story of redemption. They are incomplete on their own, just as we are on our own. The theologian Miroslav Volf uses the metaphor of a beautiful note from a cello. It may sound like one pitch, but it's actually many different resonances all at once. The string's half length, its fourth length, its eighth length. Our lives are like that. At any given time, says Volf, we do not hear only the simple, solitary tone of the present, but also our past actualities and future possibilities. Our lives are not lived in isolation, but our lives are echoing and resonating with those of countless others. In the end, I think history for grown-ups means that we have to be willing to live with mystery and ambiguity. As much as we might like, history does not offer any moral lessons tied up with a bow. It's an invitation to join a conversation, one that might be frustratingly open-ended, full of misconceptions, exclusions, people talking over and past each other. Like anything that human beings do in groups of more than 3, it will take an enormous amount of listening and understanding, withholding judgment until we know enough of what's going on. But staying in conversation with our ancestors is not optional. It's the hard work of being human, and more than that, it's what being a Christian community composed of all the saints, both the living and the dead, it's what it's all about. That's what communities of faith are for. It's what they do. Remembering the past is never going to be a task that will be finished or easy or always fun. But I am sure, knowing the work that you have already done and the conversations that you have ahead, that it will absolutely never be boring. So I look forward to listening to your own conversation. And now we're going to hear from the four amazing people who have, over the last 2 years, have devoted a significant part of their lives to this work.
I'm Helen Susu. I want to start by giving thanks to Anne McMenemy and the facility staff and Pat Hurley and all her staff because they've given tremendous support to us. And I want to take a minute to say thank you to Sam for the sermon this morning. I think that I'm not the only one that was deeply touched by it. I'm going to share with you one of the personal things that I felt when he spoke was that when he said, you know, being white and privileged, I can go home and just forget about slavery, segregation, discrimination, racism. But if I were born African American, that would not be possible. And that resonated with me. Now, each of us is going to speak briefly. We're going to try to have time for questions, but it's hard to be brief. We're going to try. So I aim to talk about the context, and Sam touched on that some. But I want to talk about briefly the 2006 Resolution A123 and the 2009 Resolution A143 passed by the General Convention of the Church. It was passed in 2006, and the same thing was reaffirmed in 2009. They urged and re-urged. They urged and re-urged us local dioceses and congregations to study our history in relation to complicity of the Church, Episcopal Church, in the institution of slavery, and in the subsequent history of segregation and discrimination. Secondly, look for examples of resistance or pushing back against slavery and discrimination. And number three, look at the economic benefits derived by the Episcopal Church from the transatlantic slave trade and the institution of slavery. So we have tried to do that. We also looked at the concept of white privilege. White privilege occurs when systems of power have been stacked to advantage white people at the expense of other racial groups. Our committee included white privilege as a focus because at Trinity we have been, and we still are, largely a community of privileged white people. So what is the accountability? Resolution 143 in 2009 required dioceses to report to General Convention in 2012 and 2015. Some dioceses, including Virginia, Maryland, Alabama, New York, Louisiana, and some others that names are not on the tip of my tongue, but the others have also made good progress in this work, while for some the work is at an early stage. So what has our diocese done? Our diocese worked on its response to these three requests from 2008 to 2012. The Diocesan Slavery and Reconciliation? Thank you! Task Force took part in a Pentecost Eve service on June 11th, 2011, and they reported to the Diocesan Convention in 2011. Our Trinity Committee began its work in 2013. So in closing, I just want to note that universities are doing similar studies of their institutions. Brown University began the trend, and in 2011, Harvard completed a study of its relationship to slavery. Other universities are now following their lead. So thank you, and Alex will speak next.
Thank you, Helen. My name is Alex Bach, and I have two short agendas for my presentation to you. First is to summarize the process we went through to put together the report, And second, to lay out the 12 specific historical areas and areas we covered in our report. Marty Cowden will follow with a summary of the themes from our work. We are a committee of 4. We're a committee of the Trinity Church Anti-Racism Team, which has been in existence for 6-7 years, and you will hear more about it later in this presentation and during the rest of this year. Our goal as a committee was to tell the history of Trinity honestly, and to acknowledge, as we do in the report, that people see issues differently at different times. They look at the same set of facts and draw different conclusions. You will see in our report, which you'll get at the end of the forum, we have lots of footnotes. There's lots of history tied up in this. We make a big effort to try and acknowledge that people can look at things differently. We read widely and interviewed many people, both Trinity parishioners and folks outside of Trinity. We focused on facts, documented our sources. We know it's not a perfect document. We look for comments, and we'll talk to you about it in a few minutes. The process internally in the world of transparency in Trinity today was we presented our report to first to our committee, clergy, and the vestry in the spring, got a lot of comments, worked over the summer, and redrafted the document, went back to the anti-racism team, went back to the vestry, back to the clergy. We hope you will find this a document that you will find useful and interesting, and we're certain you'll learn something about Trinity that you didn't know. In summarizing our work, we identified 12 moments in the history of Trinity Church that illustrate aspects of our history related to white privilege, slavery, segregation, and also resistance to these forces, as we sought to understand more clearly the character of the church and its larger community from the early 18th century to the 21st century. The 12 areas we looked at in particular, and there are things we didn't cover. We picked particular areas, so this is not a full inclusive. It covers from beginning to now, but there are stuff that didn't get covered. The first area we looked at was colonial Trinity from its founding around 1730 through the Revolutionary War. We then looked at the history of 156 people of color who were baptized at Trinity Church between 1740 and 1830, and how that happened and what that meant and what that meant for the church at the time. Then we looked at the era of Trinity's role in the struggle to end slavery, the 1820 to 1865 era. Sam spoke of that today. We were unable to find in any history book a reference to someone who was at Trinity who was an abolitionist. We did find that there was a vestry member here for 57 years named Robert Winthrop, who was the Speaker of the U.S. House, a member of Congress at Trinity in the late 1840s, and was sought to then become the senator following Daniel Webster, and was not elected because the Free Soilers were opposed to him. He was opposed to abolition. After looking at that era, we look at the era of Phillips Brooks and how he showed up here. He was perhaps the leading abolitionist preacher in the country during the Civil War. He came to Trinity after the Civil War, and we go through his history both before and then when he's here. We look at the issue of how this church was built in the 1870s, issue of pew holders, and the story of how the back bay was built and sort of what decisions were made then. We look at the issue of pew ownership and governance in the church, and it has changed. It used to be you had to buy a pew and pay a yearly tax on it. And the question of where people sat. And we have, there is an 1829 chart we found that shows colors in the upstairs in the church. In the prior, not this church, but in the prior building of Trinity. We looked at a woman named Vida Dudden Scudder, who was a woman in the late 1800s who was a leader in the settlement house movement and was a Trinity person of great wealth, great intellectual wealth, and who is listed in our Book of Saints for the Episcopal Church. We then looked at, and Sam mentions this today, Henry Knox Sherrill, a name many of you I don't think know. In 1951, he was on the cover of Time magazine as the face of American Christianity. He was a rector here, later the head of the Episcopal Church nationally, is one of the 2 or 3 people seen as critical in the building of ecumenical relations among different religions in the country. He also, because of the era he served, he was involved in the civil rights era and we walked through the good things he did. The church, as all was perhaps slow, but also was a leader compared to its other institutions. We then have a chapter which we spent a lot of time on this summer, looking at the integration of Boston's public schools and Trinity's role in those struggles. Sam mentioned both Reverend Sam Tyler and Reverend Tom Kennedy were amazing in the role they played of urban ministries in Boston from the late 40s through the late 70s, and we document that. We then look at the people of color on Trinity's vestry, clergy, and the history and our staff, and document just the cold numbers of when those happened and how those happened. And then we finish up with the history of our team, and which was commissioned by Ann Bonnyman when she was rector here, and she helped drive the process of getting us going. So that you'll see in the report. I'd now like to ask Marty Cowden to come up.
Thank you, Alex. My name is Marty Cowden, and I'm going to give you a brief summary of the general themes that we took from all of our research. The National Episcopal Church's work and that of our own diocese focused our efforts on delving deeply into our past as Christians and as Trinity parishioners. In the 17th and 18th centuries, slaveholding and slave trading were very common within Boston's merchants and other prosperous residents. While ships from Rhode Island carried more enslaved Africans than any other New England colony, Massachusetts ranked second. Evidence shows that the wealth of some of the early Trinity Church leaders and contributors was generated directly or indirectly from the slave trade and from slavery. For much of our history, Trinity Church has overtly or indirectly excluded blacks as active members of our church community. The complexity of this institutional racism is shown through many strands of our history. First, blacks were baptized at Trinity as early as 1740. Most blacks were baptized before the 1780s on the list of baptisms were very likely household slaves of Trinity's pew-holding families. Second, it appears the Trinity Church was not actively involved in the abolitionist movement, as Alex noted. None of our sources on the subject mentioned any Trinity involvement in abolitionist activities. And in fact, the 1933 History of Trinity Church, the little blue book that some of you may have seen, doesn't include any mention of the Civil War or abolitionism in its discussion of the Right Reverend Mannion Eastbourne, who was rector from 1842 to 1868. Third, pews were owned by Boston's white elite, and at least some of the galleries were specifically labeled for coloreds, as documented by the 1829 plan and valuation of the pews of Trinity Church, Boston. A few oral histories indicate also that some blacks were directed to the galleries well into the 20th century. Fourth, the Reverends Brooks and Sherrill were outspoken and active in their anti-racist work before and after they came to Trinity Church, but they were not public leaders in this area while they were at Trinity. Fifth, there have been very few people of color represented in the clergy and the lay leadership and on the staff of Trinity Church. Recently, however, Trinity Boston Foundation has made a particular concerted effort to hire people of color and have been more successful. Sixth, from at least the 1800s, Trinity Church clergy and parishioners were active in reaching out to those in need across the city through establishment of mission churches, the settlement house movement, and more recently through the work of, as Alex noted, Sam Tyler, the Second Mile Committee, and other church efforts. But often, particularly in earlier times, white people looked hard to help blacks or other economically disadvantaged groups, rather than involving them as equal partners in the work. When Trinity was confronted with issues of poverty and race in the city and beyond in the second half of the 20th century, Its leadership, clergy, and many active parishioners got involved in efforts for social justice. They helped to form a landscape of organizations that still shape Boston in positive ways today. At the same time, though, the church community was too shaken and perhaps too divided to take a visible stance in the busing and school desegregation controversy, the central race relations issue of our era. The church was deeply enmeshed in all the complexities, triumphs, and failings of Boston as it struggled with questions of social justice in that period, and in fact a set of questions which are largely persisting today. So those are our general themes. We know our research is evolving and we know it's not perfect, and that it reflects the fact that most American history was written from a perspective of those in power at the time, and primarily those were wealthy white men. If we've suggested connections that people don't see, well, we welcome your comments and suggestions on how to build on our document and expand our knowledge of our collective past. And now Judith is going to talk about how we can all do that as we move forward.
I'm Judith Radke, and I get to talk about going forward. We will have an email address on the website this week where you can send comments to us directly. And we also have set up a group of meetings. You have that information on your papers, so I just want to clarify that we've divided our information. Thank you. We've divided our information into the first half and the second half. A is the first half, B is the second half. So that if you go to the November 6th, you'll get the first half. If you go to November 11th, you'll get it again, which may not be a bad thing because it'll be different people and they'll talk about it differently. But in order to get the full spread, you need to go to all the A's or all the B's. The discussions will be led by the 4 members of the history team. And this is an opportunity for you and us to react, make suggestions going forward, and think about consequences and reconciliation. Some of the other things that are going to be happening, the big one is coming on Martin Luther King weekend, the Ann Bonneman Symposium. The Right Reverend Michael Curry, Bishop of North Carolina, will be preaching at both services. Marian Wright Edelman, founder of the Children's Defense Fund, is the keynote speaker. And there will be a seminar discussion group with local leaders, which will be led by our own Barbara Dorch O'Cara. There will be music, food, discussion, and commitments going forward. Everyone is welcome, and I think it'll be a marvelous day. We, as you may know, have an ongoing anti-racism book club that meets, the next one meets Sunday, November 16th in the Ferris Library. We're reading Disowning Slavery, The Gradual Emancipation and Race in New England, which is a story we really don't know, or at least I didn't. And you're welcome to come to that, whether you've been able to read the book or not, because the discussion is so lively. That pretty well sums up the first adventures we're going to have with this. Everyone, please try to come to one of the discussions. I think you will find some of this material quite challenging. And we'd like to hear what you have to say. We've been kind of buried in it for quite a while, so it'll be nice to have other people's take.